Ambassador McFaul, let me read you this. It was the scoop in Axios about Elon Musk's role. Donald Trump's phone call with Ukrainian President Zelensky on Wednesday included two surprises. Elon Musk was on the line, and Zelensky was somewhat reassured by what he heard from the president-elect. That's according to two sources with knowledge of the call. The new details of the call underscore how influential Musk could be in the second Trump administration and the uncertainty over how exactly Trump will approach Ukraine. Why might President Zelensky have been reassured by Musk's presence on the call?
Well, I don't know if he actually was, but that's exactly what he has to say. OK, and which is to say that we were talking about Europe before the break. Many countries, including in Ukraine, I was just in Berlin and Prague a few weeks ago. They've been planning for this outcome. This is not like 2016. They've been courting various people that they think are in the Trump orbit to try to get their ear, particularly the Ukrainians, because they are in an existential fight for the sovereignty of their country. And right after President-elect won the election, who was the first to tweet about it in flattering ways, just like Vladimir Putin understands flattery? Zelensky does too. Zelensky is leaning into this idea of an outsider, right? A television personality outsider, just like you, Mr. Trump, because he has to do all that he can to now work with this administration. He doesn't have the luxury of sitting in Palo Alto like I do and analyzing what these populists are going to do. He is in a fight for his life. And now he has to deal with President-elect Trump and people around him like Elon Musk, who might just pop on calls from time to time in the new second Trump term.
You know, Ben Rhodes, a Ukrainian friend said to me that Trump is still Trump, that he can still be easily and almost admittedly maneuvered by flattery. The whole world knows that. How might that be used by clever leaders in democracies to serve democracy?
You know, I hate to be pessimistic about this, Nicole, but look, we have to learn from the first time around. And I talked to a lot of European governments at that time, as I'm sure Mike and John did. They all tried it, right? You'll remember Macron really tried to flatter him, ended up in getting tariffs and huge spats. Theresa May tried to flatter him, ended up in the same place. They're all going to try it again because why not? They have to. I just don't think at the end of the day, they're the people he likes. You know, people who run liberal democracies are not the people that Donald Trump feels affinity to around the world. That's what he says. You know, have you ever heard him when he lists his friends like Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un and all these people? He's never listing, you know, maybe Boris Johnson might sneak in there, I guess. But now you got a Labour government in the UK. So they'll try flattering. But I think what's actually more important is to know what your backup plan is here, if you're the Ukrainians or if you're the Europeans. And to know, you know, in the United States system, I think it's also really important for those people to be talking to Republicans in Congress. You know, that actually worked better for Ukraine, including in the Trump administration. A lot of the assistance that flowed to Ukraine in the Trump administration was because there were large majorities in Congress, including Republicans, who wanted to do that. So it's not just about, you know, Trump himself and can I build this personal relationship with him? Because the reality is, you know, I'm sure Trump was very nice to Zelensky because if people flatter him, you know, he says nice things back. But I think we've seen that doesn't necessarily translate him into doing the thing that you want him to do. The Elon Musk part of this is pretty notable, too. You know, it's kind of oligarchy vibes, Nicole. It's in the sense that you've got these kind of titans of industry who are also titans of government. It's very Putin-esque, frankly. Early years of Putin, as Mike knows, to have these kind of oligarchs who are both businessmen but kind of helping to run the government. But what's alarming there is that Elon Musk himself has, you know, tweeted out that, you know, he supports his peace plan that is basically Putin's peace plan, which is you kind of freeze the conflict and Russia gets everything they currently have. Frankly, I agree with Mike, that's probably not even on the table. Russia's going to push further. But it does speak to the fact he's going to play this kind of strange role that's blending his business interests and his government role and his advisory role. And that's a new dynamic. We haven't seen that in the United States in a very long time.
I want to show you some of what I think you're talking about, Ben Rose, which is that when given the opportunity to say something nice about a Democratic leader, he never takes it. When giving the opportunity, even in friendly interviews, to condemn the world's dictators, he never takes that either. Here's Trump on Orban and Xi.
That was the question they asked Viktor Orban, who's really considered a very strong. They said he's a strong man. Sometimes you need a strong man. He's a strong man. They said he called President Xi brilliant. Well, he's a brilliant guy. He controls 1.4 billion people with an iron fist. I mean, he's a brilliant guy, whether you like it or not. And they go crazy.
Right. Say, it doesn't mean he's not evil, or it doesn't mean he's not.
Yeah, of course not.
Dangerous.
But actually, we have evil people in our country.
That Rogan clip, Director Brennan, is so reminiscent of an interview that Trump did with Joe Scarborough and the guy at Fox, O'Reilly, where he's questioning him about Putin, and he says, you know, and Joe did and O'Reilly did, but, you know, but he kills people, he kills journalists, and Trump defiantly says, well, we kill people too, and you know, good on. Mr. Rogan there to say it doesn't mean he's not dangerous, it doesn't mean he's not evil. And Trump sees no difference between the brutality in an autocracy and what his role will be as president. What signal does that send to you, Director Brennan?
It sends the signal that Donald Trump is most impressed by ruthless strength and wealth. And if you look at the people that he associates with and speaks highly of, whether it be of Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping or Viktor Orban, these are individuals who have been able to manipulate the politics and the system within their countries in order to suppress any opposition and to be the authoritarian leader that I think Donald Trump wants to be. Also, Elon Musk being the wealthiest person in the world, this is something that Donald Trump salivates over and wants to have a person like Elon Musk very much associated and affiliated with the administration. You know, when Donald Trump was elected in 2016, I was hoping that he was going to grow into the role of the presidency. In fact, I told the CIA workforce, you know, that once he assumes the responsibilities of the presidency, that he's going to recognize just how important that role is. And his first term was a serious disappointment in that regard. And unfortunately, I think we have a track record here. And now this second term, he's limited supposedly by the Constitution, by the law, into only 2 terms, that he is going to, I think, try to do as much as he can in order to be the disruptive leader, the autocratic, authoritarian leader that he wants to be. And so I do think that looking at the years ahead, this is going to be a very turbulent time, not just for U.S. national security and domestic policy, but also for the global landscape in terms of how the U.S. role is evolving and how Russia, China, and others are going to take advantage of that.
And then there was disinformation. President-elect Trump successfully harnessed the anger and frustration felt by millions of Americans and used it to score a decisive election victory. This is a new analysis by the New York Times, finding how Trump won came down to one essential bet, that his grievances could meld with those of the MAGA movement, and then with the Republican Party, and then with more than half the country. His mugshot became a best-selling shirt. His criminal conviction inspired $100 million in donations in one day. The images of him bleeding after a failed assassination attempt became the symbol of what supporters saw as a campaign of destiny. The paper continues. At times, Mr. Trump could be so crude and self-indulgent on the stump that aides wondered if he were engaged in an absurdist experiment to test how much aberrant behavior voters would tolerate. However, Trump tapped into the anger and frustration millions of voters felt about some of the very institutions and systems he will soon control as the country's 47th president. Voters unhappy with the nation's direction turned him into a vessel for their rage. Reverend Dow, what do you make of that assessment?
I think it's right on. I think that they hit the real reason that we are where we are. And that is that everyday people of all races that were suffering from economic insecurity, inflation, and others felt they were not being addressed. And many of us kept warning that you can't have the Beltway intellectuals guide this. There were people in the campaign trying to fight back. Mignon Moore, Leah Daughtry was telling them, wait a minute, you got to listen to people. Trump was in a very crafty way, saying, yes, butter's too high. Yes, you're suffering. And they did it. Well, the other side was not saying why this was the case. Therefore, it was interpreted that you don't understand what I'm going through. And telling me about all this stuff that he's done doesn't answer the reason I'm in the condition I'm in.
I saw them try, but I guess not enough.
Yeah, I mean, there are certainly similarities to what we saw in 2016 and now, where there was just this anger that the elites were doing well, the rest of us were suffering. That's what the bet was, and it was aftermath of the Great Recession, and now the aftermath of the pandemic, resulting inflation. We're seeing leaders of democracies across the globe either lose jobs or at least be severely weakened in its aftermath. So, Zandy, your publication has a new piece which has the title, "Welcome to Trump's World." The Economist writes in part this: in 2016, some people comforted themselves with the thought that Mr. Trump's presidency was an aberration by choosing to overlook his attempts to stop the transfer of power to Mr. Biden in 2020. Voters have shown how wrong that conclusion was. Instead, they have endorsed Mr. Trump's unbounded exploitation of partisanship as the basis of his politics, including the slander of his opponents as corrupt and treacherous. This has spread a cynicism and despair about the merits of government that may serve him but will not serve America's democracy. MAGA is a movement of iconoclasm against the kind of benign internationalists who occupied the White House for 70 years. This week, a majority of voters embraced it with their eyes open. And digging a little deeper on this, it's not just that we've all seen Trump's conduct in office with the impeachments and the insurrection, but also what he has pledged to do, mass deportations, a crackdown on his enemies, and a majority of Americans looked around and said, yes, we'll take it.
This is what we want.
They did, but I think I would frame it slightly different to the New York Times, which is, I think there was definitely, amongst his core supporters, there's a sort of fanatical Trumpism in the belief in everything he does. I think many ordinary people, many Americans of all walks of life, when it wasn't necessarily rage, it was just they thought, actually, he says a whole bunch of things that I don't believe. The first term was pretty good, and on important things that matter to me, he actually is talking, they think, sense. On immigration, it is true that this government has failed to deal with the border until very recently. It's a real problem. He got it. He got the sense of that many people feel that the kind of culture wars and the progressive slant of the Democratic Party is out of sync with Americans on gender, on trans issues, on all of that kind of stuff. And those were the ads that really went. And I think he taps into a sense which is it's not so much just a feeling of rage. It's a sense that people, Americans across the board, think that he is closer to them than Democrats are. But the reason we wrote this bigger picture editorial is that what is definitely clear is that his sense of America's role and what America should be doing in the world is very different than the last 70 years. This is a protectionist view. This is a view of much more akin to the 1930s. That's why I think this is a shift. Really, we have to go back 70 years to see a shift like this. And I would posit that the consequences for those of us who live outside America are going to be, as alarming or more alarming. And I think that you can go around the world and see, and it's not surprising that foreign leaders were picking up the phone and tweeting out congratulations in sort of as fast as they could, because no one kind of knows what he's going to do. Everyone wants to get on his right side. Everyone knows he's transactional. He wants American strength. They don't quite know what that means. And so they're trying to position themselves to get in his good books. And actually, I think, and this may surprise you, he may not be as bad, for example, for Ukraine as many people think. And I was very struck in our reporting this week. My colleague based in Kiev wrote an excellent piece that suggests senior people in Kiev were rather hoping for a Trump victory because they were so fed up of the sort of self-denial and timidity of the Biden administration that they felt, they weren't getting the weaponry that they needed. There was a sense that there was so much worry in Washington right now about escalation by Putin. So I think it's like the whole post-war order has been thrown up, shaken up. And we spoke last week, and I said, when we wrote our endorsement leader, I said, it may be that we'll get through this and it'll be like Trump won. And my goodness, I hope that's right. The risks were too high for me, which is why we were worried about it. I just hope these tail risks don't come to pass and that we actually get... There are some good things that could come of this. I know it's hard to...
Yeah.
It's hard for you to think about that right now, but there are areas that could be deregulation. I think there is a huge amount that he could do, good things that he could do. There are good things that could be done in foreign policy. We just have to hope they get done and the risks aren't. And I think rather than... I'm trying to look forward and I'm trying to look positive about it. And I think that at the moment it's just up in the air and it depends what Trump we get.
To see where it lands. Yeah. And as we're looking back, Willie, to Zenny's point, Joe had been mentioning those ads, those misleading trans ads that they spent, I think, $30 million on. And were airing just everywhere, especially in front of football audiences, and made a difference.
Yeah, no question about it. We've talked about that. Those broke through, and that showed up in the exit polling. So
today, Democrats continue to grapple with these election results, and we are seeing a tradition that we always see after losing campaigns, although based on what I've seen, evidence past races, this one is more severe, and that's understandable. So there are recriminations, blame, stories being told. We'll get to some of that tonight. But there's also an immediate emphasis on resilience and a type of newfound resistance to Donald Trump that isn't just a version of the first term or a sequel of what Democrats did in that so-called resistance. And given the raw fact that Democrats lost both the White House and the Senate, we are hearing today from Democratic governors.
We will be prepared for whatever comes, and we will do everything in our power to defend the rights of Washingtonians, the people of this great state.
If you try to harm New Yorkers or roll back their rights, I will fight you every step of the way.
You come for my people, you come through me.
There you have it. And we do live in a country of federalism where states are, as we all know, but sometimes we forget how it works, separate governments. That's why they have separate police forces and a separate legal system, right? State laws. And we have governors here who are reacting, and this is fully lawful, fully within their powers as they run states, but they're reacting obviously somewhat differently from the usual thing after an election. And part of the reasoning, we think, is just the raw math I mentioned. They know that their party, the Democratic Party, is being exited out of the White House and the Senate. So the governors are stepping up. Over in California, there will actually be a special legislative session to work on policies that will maintain California's priorities, according to the governor and the Democrats who rule that state, against the incoming federal administration. Some activist groups are organizing a march trying to set a tone that there is not just a rolling over of civic activism and activity, even if the election results were decisively against certain liberal causes. And that will be January 18th in Washington, right before Trump's inauguration. And they are putting the word out now early, hoping to bring out many thousands. Democrats also are looking at the lessons. There are many ways to address a loss, and this was a decisive loss. Not a Reagan-esque mandate, and we can talk about that, but a major loss. I think that's clear. And so one of the key points that people are looking at in the Democratic Party already is the 2004 loss to George W. Bush. The Times' Ezra Klein, who has been unsparing in facing the Democrats' problems this year, including how they held on with Biden for so long, is saying, quote, "In my lifetime until today, that was the most total rejection liberals experienced. By 2004, Americans knew who Bush was and what he had done. They chose him anyway." That's roughly what happened Tuesday night. But the silver lining, say some Democrats, is that while there was a lot of Republican bragging about the supposed mandate, Bush's second term was stalled on many of those big provisions. And you know the Obama era came after that. Here's what it sounded like in those second terms.
I earned capital in the campaign, political capital, and now I intend to spend it.
America has given us an unprecedented and powerful mandate.
It's not unprecedented in the literal sense of the word. It was precedented. There are many precedents of people, president-elects, who've won elections at the margin of Trump. That's precedent, and at much larger margins. We are accustomed to how he may exaggerate, but it matters if people think this was a bigger win than it was, although don't mishear me, it was a decisive win. So why are we talking about 2004? Well, Democrats are reminding everyone, again, that near total low point, as the writer Ezra Klein put it, was just years away from the resurgence. In 2004, the new incoming head of the DNC after the Democrats lost was Howard Dean. And he said something that we've heard actually this week, that people with big ideas or progressive principles for America can't just wait on a savior every 4 years or only look to presidential politics. He talked about local activism, about funding it in a real way, and about competing even in places that the D.C. Democrats at the time had written off. It was called then a 50-state strategy. Democrats would go everywhere, even into deep red areas. That was controversial at the time, including by the D.C.-based sort of elite thinkers who said, well, you really got to go blue or purple. You got to keep an eye on the electoral map, yada, yada. The Washington Post at the time, we can remind you, said there was a big debate on that plan. Another outlet said that there were nasty whispers among party donors and activists who were just asking, what does Dean even mean by this, quote, crazy 50-state strategy? So that brings you all the way back to that time period and how it was considered debatable to even go out and organize on the ground. Of course, that's what the Republican pro-life movement has done. That's, by the way, what Trump did to sometimes mockery in the last year when he would go into these blue states. Is he really going to win New York or New Jersey? He didn't. But even though he didn't win those places, he improved his numbers considerably. Now, I'm not saying that Donald Trump ran a deliberate 50-state strategy. There's a lot of different sort of things that go on inside Donald Trump's campaign about where to put him and what he's doing. But it was a choice to do that very controversial closing rally inside Manhattan, a blue city that he did not win and did not expect to win. But he did improve his numbers in these other places, and Republicans are looking at that as a positive. Dean was urging Democrats to do that back before it was cool. And by the 2006 midterms, which was just 2 years later, the New York Times was writing about the vindication of that approach. Quote, Dean's 50-state love fest, his 50-state strategy helping Democrats win control of the House, the Senate, a majority of the governor's offices, and state legislatures across the nation.
The 50-state strategy is important because we want to compete everywhere. There's no place that Democrats should fear to tread anywhere in America.
Howard Dean was right in rebuilding our parties in 50 states. He did it.
He wanted a 50-state strategy. Well, he didn't get all 50 states, but he got enough of them to take back the House, the Senate, and the presidency.
The key point is that whole thing came out of a loss. And while most people don't, in sports and politics or most other endeavors, deliberately court a big loss, sometimes it is losses that force the reckoning, larger changes, the cliches like necessity is the mother of invention, all that stuff. And then it was that loss that the Democrats dealt Republicans that had Bush leaders like Karl Rove talking about what they had to learn from Dean.
I hate to say it, but we need to copy what Howard Dean did, and that is make our ground game in all 50 states. Look, we didn't have a ground game in a lot of these states with Senate races, and so we lost North Dakota by 3,300 votes. We need to have a better ground game in all 50 states.
Now, that is one component of several that you would look at during these times. There was also fatigue with the Iraq War. The win in those midterms set up a certainly wider energy for the Democrats. They were on offense, and that's when they looked beyond what at the time would have been the more establishment figure in Hillary Clinton to embrace Barack Obama, and that also worked. All these things are interconnected. None of them can be planned. We have to have intellectual humility. I told you that before the election when we were covering this night after night and saying it looked pretty close, pretty tied, and it was pretty close, except Donald Trump had the better of the battlegrounds, as people know. So what could we learn from this history? As I tell you, Democrats are looking to governors. Dean famously was a governor and then ran for president. And ultimately, as all those things worked, he became party chair. It's the kind of night after a week like this where you might want to check in with someone either close to Dean or who worked on his campaigns, or maybe Howard Dean himself, governor, doctor, and chair of the DNC. Welcome back.
Thanks for having me. We missed you.
You remember all that?
Yeah, I do remember all that. And it was met with scorn and derision inside the Beltway. And inside the Beltway are always the last people to figure out what's really going on in the country.
What I'm just turning your volume up. Don't mind me. I'm just doing this here. What else do you think applies now?
I actually think that the 50-state strategy has gone into some disrepair. Unfortunately, President Obama, who was a terrific president, but he didn't have a lot of use for the DNC and tried to set up a parallel organization. The DNC essentially fell apart. for about 8 years. And it's got to be rebuilt. But the problem with the DNC is it's an inside the Beltway organization still. And I'm actually working with some people who were involved in my campaign and who were involved with the DNC that I ran to try to figure out how we're going to do what the Republicans did. I saw the clip of Rose saying we ought to do what Howard Dean did. Well, we now have to do what the Republicans did. The Republicans have run a real 50-state strategy for quite some time. And what they do that we don't, although we try, but our setup isn't right for it. They run candidates for every office in the United States of America, often financed by billionaires like the Koch brothers. But they run for the school board, they run for state representative, they run for city council. We have to do that. Clausewitz once said that politics is simply war by another means. The Republicans learned that lesson and they practice it. We have yet to do that. I actually think Harris ran a very good campaign. I don't criticize it. And I don't think the DNC did a terrible job. I don't criticize the DNC. But we are still not in the state. Giving the states money is not enough because a lot of the state parties aren't working properly, partly because they don't have money. So we have to set up an organization, which may be a parallel organization that's outside Washington and that is well financed. And I think the business community, the Democrats in the business community, are going to get this before the people inside the Beltway. I don't want to diss the people inside the Beltway too much, but it is middle school on steroids. They're smart, they work hard, and it's all about them all the time, even the people I like. You have to focus not on the next senatorial race, but you've got to focus on the state senator races. In Missouri, and if you show up at their door consistently, eventually you're going to win. And that happens, and it is going to happen, but we have to finance it and we have to build it. And it cannot be run out of Washington.
Back in 2016, the election of Donald Trump was a radicalizing moment for many women in America and across the world. An open misogynist beating Hillary Clinton, the first female nominee of any major party, even after the Access Hollywood tape leaked, brought about a global movement through the sheer force of women's rage and what they had been asked to endure.
They descended on the Capitol and cities around the world by the hundreds of thousands. Far more people marching for women's rights on President Trump's first full day in office than attended his inauguration. Tens of thousands more marching in Chicago, Boston, and Seattle. And overseas in England, Italy, Germany, and Paris. Crowds of mostly women, all protesting President Trump.
Trump era also gave us, just a few months actually after those marches, the Me Too movement. Another massive cultural shift led by women who were tired of men like Donald Trump, just one example, but many, many, many others, mistreating and abusing women with seemingly total impunity. Now, nearly 8 years later, Donald Trump is heading back to the White House after running, I think it's fair to say, the most misogynistic campaign I've ever seen. He took credit for tearing reproductive rights away from millions of women. He was found civilly liable for sexually abusing and defaming E. Jean Carroll and continued to defame her. He picked a running mate who railed against childless cat ladies. Trump won the election regardless. And the misogynistic trolls feel even more emboldened than ever before.
I'm just a girl standing in front of the world asking for a president who isn't a rapist. Request denied!
The feel when we control your bodies. Hey, bitch, we control your bodies. Guess what? Guys win again, okay? Men win again. And yes, we control your bodies. Hi, I'm your Republican congressman. Hi, I'm your Republican congressman. It's your body, my choice.
Disgusting comments like that are going viral. They're setting the groundwork for a massive backlash. But one lesson nobody learned from Trump the first time around was that every action has an equal and opposite reaction. The action was Trump's ascendancy, and the reaction was a global movement centering women's righteous anger. We are already seeing the ripples of another movement based on that anger, and I am predicting we are going to get a bigger reaction than 2017 this time around. It is just a question of when, where, and how. Donald Trump's third bid for the White House was arguably his most misogynistic yet, and his supporters heard the message loud and clear. Even on election night, before the race was called for Trump, the sort of white supremacist, Nazi-friendly troll And Mar-a-Lago dinner guest Nick Fuentes tweeted, quote, "Your body, my choice forever." What we're seeing now is a backlash to that rank misogyny in tweets and videos all over social media. Women are pushing back against the Trump supporters who want to undo decades of progress on women's rights. Now the question is if and when that rage will boil over into something like we saw back in 2017 when millions of women took to the streets to send a clear message to Donald Trump. Michelle Goldberg is an opinion columnist at the New York Times, where she writes, "This is who we are now." Heather McGhee, longtime progressive strategist, author of the best-selling book, The Sum of Us, and They Join Me Now. How you guys doing?
We're hanging in there. We are hanging in there.
I really think that there's going to be echoes and rhymes, but not repetition.
Yeah.
Second time around.
Yep.
So what do you think? What do you think is happening?
So I think, when Donald Trump won the first time, it was such a profound shock. And it also felt like kind of a fluke or an accident,
Yes.
which is part of what propelled so many women onto the street. That is not the case this time. Both because there was reason to see it coming, there was, it's no longer improbable, and also he won the popular vote, right? So there isn't this same sense of democratic illegitimacy. And yet, of course, women are both outraged and I think many rightly terrified. For now, I think there's something of a pulling back. And also I believe, and I think you're already seeing seeds of this, there was already intense alienation between young men and young women in this country, right? That's part of the kind of seed of this broader social crisis.
Totally.
And anyone who thought that Donald Trump's election was going to do anything but exacerbate that is in for a rude shock.
Yeah. I think that we have to also zoom back and think about where this is all coming from beyond Donald Trump, right? I always like to think about who is selling these racist and sexist ideas for their own profit, in addition to who's desperate enough to buy them, right? And who's selling them is an entire ecosystem, an information ecosystem, from the video games, the podcasters, the sports betting influencers. It's a whole world that if you're not in it, you really don't know who these people are, that make up the living, breathing culture of so many young men in this society. And they are doing it for profit, right? And then you've got the social media, which now, of course, is owned, in part by Elon Musk, who not only is going to continue to do what social media just does as its own, which is really subsidize and manipulate so that the most outrageous things become the most profitable things for them. But he believes these things himself. He's, in fact, like a huge avatar of this misogyny and this racism and this greed. And so I just think we need to really recognize that everything we believe comes from a story we've been told.
Yes, it's a great
And
point.
these people...
They don't just exist.
They don't just exist, right? There are material conditions, right? There's women advancing in society. There's all these things, right? But it's also true that the meaning-making about the material conditions is completely owned right now by the right wing. And that's our problem and our responsibility to fix.
I got to say this. I have 3 kids. I have a daughter, son, daughter. My son is... I don't talk about my kids a lot on the show, but I will just for a moment. I love my kids. They're totally incredible. I think the universe of them. And my son is just an incredibly sweet and emotionally intelligent kid. And one of the things I worry about, I worry a lot of things about my daughters. But one of the biggest things I worry about for my son is the poison, the absolute poison being pumped into the brains of boys. Yeah. Boys. These are, these are children forming that is this rank misogyny. It's so disgusting. It's so pervasive. I think people that don't, I see it partly because I like to look at a lot of weightlifting videos and the algorithm is just oh, you like to weightlift. Here's all this horrible stuff. And it's a huge problem.
Yeah, it's a huge problem, and it's a problem that is going to get worse. It will culturally get worse, but it will also just get worse in terms of any attempt at regulation, right? Because that's part of what Elon Musk bought with his massive contributions to Donald Trump, right? So they've decided that any attempts to regulate social media is, kind of de facto censorship, and so they get to just, pump this stuff into our kids' feeds relentlessly.
I think there's also ways to think about alternatives.
Yeah.
And
absolutely.
making other meaning. This is the thing that I really am thinking a lot about recently is making meaning for young people, whatever their gender identity is, about who they are in the world that isn't just like reactionary and bad.
Listen, I think liberals have gone behind the paywall, right? And if you look at news media and media in general, right, you've got the loss of the local newspaper, right? 70% of newspapers, right? We've got more than half of counties have no local news anymore, right? You've got Sinclair, reaching 70%. It's a right-wing local broadcaster for news, reaching 70% of households. So you've lost all of this local news that used to just have a flavor of humanity to it and localism in favor of this sort of national zero-sum, fully within the propaganda kind of strategy. And so in that vacuum, and then you've got, I think it's around 70% of, kind of good journalism is behind a paywall, right? And so you're having this education-based gap in what people have access to in information. And that is, I think, the sort of table stakes for how we got to this place.
In terms of these sort of reaction, which is the thing I keep thinking about, having lived through a bunch of cycles where it's like, I woke up on the morning after the last Republican president won a national popular majority, George W. Bush, just being like, well, we're cooked. Like, he's a colossus. And then it was like, things changed real quick.
And you remember, it's like, I've got political capital, and I'm going to spend it. And it lasted a few months.
You're right, because he tried to privatize Social Security, he got his butt kicked. But in terms of this action reaction, that, there's this 4B movement that has been propping up. And I've been seeing this, which I also think is 100% understandable, but also is part of the social media negative polarization churn. Explain 4B.
Right. So 4B, it's a South Korean movement. In South Korea, if you want to look at kind of, not necessarily a worst case scenario, but a scary scenario for where this goes, where women and men are so far apart, where they have an anti-feminist troll as the leader of the country. And part of how women have reacted to this rampant misogyny is just to withdraw. So 4B movement is just to basically give up men, give up family, give up babies, focus on your career, focus on your own stability. And the thing is, women are doing better already in terms of education, in terms of their career prospects. And there was, I think, until there was an understanding that was something that we kind of had to address the pain of young men. It's hard to see how you do that when young men are, rubbing their hands and trying to kind of, put their red-hatted kind of, planning to grind their boot into the necks of these women. So I think what you'll see is kind of more, because you talk about the media that men are consuming, but women are also consuming their own media on TikTok, their own podcasts, which is telling them basically that you need to stay away from men who voted for Donald Trump.
And to your point about the environment we're all in is one where there's a few small corporations that basically profit off of the attention that's created by this conflict.
Exactly. And meanwhile, policy's being made and we're just,
policy, which was, we tried here in our little corner to talk about policy all the time. We really did.
Yes, I know.
Just totally absent from the campaign.
Yeah.
Just no one knows what anyone did.
And one of the things that the right is driven by are falling birth rates. If you look at South Korea, you're talking about, you have seen nothing yet.
And yes, mutual alienation is not going to help that. Michelle Goldberg and Heather McGhee, thank you both.
Let me turn to California Attorney General Rob Bonta, who will be handling these potential legal fights against a Trump administration. It's good to see you. In response to Governor Newsom calling this special session, Donald Trump just this morning said that Gavin Newsom is trying to kill our nation's beautiful California. He's made some similar comments before. So why is this special session needed? What do you need and what's your plan?
Interesting comment from a non-Californian. The Californians think differently, including our leadership, and we made our voice heard very clearly through the election here. Trump was a big loser, lost by almost 2 million votes, and Trump and Trumpism was firmly rejected here in California. We're going to continue on our path to progress. We're going to continue moving forward, pursuing rights and freedoms, reproductive freedom, gun safety, compassionate and humane treatment of our immigrants, climate action. And we anticipate that we will need additional resources and funding for that. I'm grateful to have had the opportunity to speak with our governor 2 days ago when he was on the verge of calling the special session. The special session is about getting my office primarily the resources needed to continue our path forward, continue our progress in the likely event of some significant headwinds coming from Washington, D.C. So we are doubling down on who we are, what we stand for, our values, our people, our progress, fighting for our future. And we're going to have the resources ready to fight in court, push back, punch back, fight back as necessary if the Trump administration gets in the way.
So, as you know, in the closing weeks, months of his campaign, Donald Trump made it very clear that a top priority of his is mass deportation. Yesterday, when he was talking to our Kristen Welker, it was what he spoke about most. What is your level of concern about what might happen, and how are you preparing for it?
Of course, we're very concerned. We're not surprised. From in Trump 1.0, he had the same intentions. We fought back and pushed back. We pushed back against a DACA rollback. We pushed back against a public charge rule. We pushed back against other efforts on his part to take on our immigrants and hurt and harm them, including trying to withhold money from so-called sanctuary cities. So we've been thinking about preparing, strategizing about how to support and uplift and protect our immigrants in California for months. Hoping that this time wouldn't come, but knowing that it might, not able to guarantee that it wouldn't. And so now it's here and we're ready. We're prepared. We have a plan. He has projected what he will do through his own articulated statements, those close to him, Project 2025, and we are ready to respond as appropriate. And so to our immigrant communities, I say, I see you. I value you. We will fight for you. I will fight for you. Do everything in our power to make sure we push back against the Trump administration's plans.
I mentioned that your state is not the only one that's been making these moves. So I wonder what kind of conversations you might be having with other state attorneys general.
Again, we've been having conversations for months, planning for the possibility of this day with Democratic attorneys general all across the nation, thinking, planning, putting pen to paper, literally writing draft briefs, thinking about what court we will file in and when we will file it based on the action of the federal government. I think the people of our state and states across this country deserve attorneys general who are prepared, who are ready, who have been thinking about them and their future. And we are, and we have been. So we are at our best when we work together, when we're teaming up and collaborating. We have done that, working with not just other attorneys general, but advocates and experts in each of the spaces where we think are going to be under fire and under attack from immigrants to the environment, to gun safety, to reproductive freedom and healthcare more generally. So we've collaborated and partnered, prepared for this day. This day has come. We are ready.
California Attorney General Rob Bonta, thank you so much. We appreciate your time.